Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. This week, the region is known for exporting coal, but it's losing people too.
What the demographers look at is that we are basically exporting the future population of Appalachia to other regions of the country.
Folk singer Ginny Hawker grew up singing the hymns of the Primitive Baptist Church, but she didn't think of performing until she got a little boost from Appalachian icon Hazel Dickens.
She put me beside her and she held onto the back of my chair and she said in my ear, "Sing your grandfather's song and put them in his church."
And the chef of an award-winning Asheville restaurant was shaped by memories of growing up in West Virginia.
And I remember running out into the field and waddling back, armful of corn. We boiled it. I remember slathering it probably with country crock, and my head exploded off my shoulders. And it was like I've never tasted corn before until this day.
You'll hear these stories and more this week inside Appalachia.
Support for this program is brought to you by Solar Holler, helping West Virginia homeowners manage their energy costs through solar power. Details at solarholler.com. Support for this program is provided by the Thrasher Group, an architecture, engineering, and field services firm serving West Virginia clients and communities since 1983. More information at thethrashergroup.com.
Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. The population in Appalachia's coal-producing counties has declined since the boom of the 1950s. As the coal industry mechanized and shrunk, jobs went away, and young people did too. Now a series of population estimates shows things might get even worse. Journalist Jim Branscombe grew up in southwestern Virginia and recently covered this story. Jim Branscombe, thank you so much for coming on Inside Appalachia to speak with us.
My pleasure, Mason.
So the headline of your recent story in the Daily Yonder is "The Alarming Depopulation of Appalachia's Coal Fields, a Quarter Century of Projected Decline." I'd like to read the first couple of paragraphs here because they're pretty stark. By 2050, entire counties across Appalachia face the loss of nearly half their populations in what demographers describe as an accelerating demographic collapse unprecedented in American peacetime history. The demographic projections paint a devastating picture for the Appalachian coal fields. According to data from 3 major state universities, Central Appalachia faces population losses that rival the depopulation seen in war-torn regions or economic catastrophes abroad. So, what is happening in this region?
It's quite alarming, Mason. I first spotted the problem from reading Cardinal News. Dwayne Yancey had an article about the projections that were coming from the Weldon Center at the University of Virginia. And I wondered if anybody had taken a look at what was happening across the Central Appalachia as a whole. And I didn't find anything. So what I did was pull up the numbers from University of West Virginia and University of Kentucky and do a profile of what was going on in what we usually call main coalfield regions. And that's Central Appalachia, 60 counties in East Kentucky, Southern West Virginia, East Tennessee, and Southwest Virginia. The numbers are just startling, to say the least. The projections are that Buchanan County, Virginia, population will, over the next 25 years will decline 48%. Harlan County, Kentucky, the projections are it will decline 45%. Breathitt County, Kentucky, where J.D. Vance traces his roots to, is 39%. Across Southern West Virginia, it's similar numbers. McDowell County, West Virginia has sort of become the poster child for depopulation, going from 100 and some thousand at its peak down to about close to 18,000 at the present time. So we're looking at something that's never happened in peacetime America. Of course, those who are familiar with the history of Appalachia know that between the 50s and the 70s, we had about 3 million people who left the Appalachian region, migrating to, the cities in Ohio, Middletown, Ohio, like J.D. Vance has written about, Cincinnati. But there's a significant difference between what was happening then and what's happening now. What's happening now is that there's not a young population left to repopulate the region. In the 70s, we still had a young population that could repopulate the region. And that happened across the region as a whole. 1965, when ARC started out, the population of the region was about 22.5 million. Today is 26.6 million. The Southern Appalachian region in particular has been growing. The dynamic is that we're in a spiral here. The basic premise of what the demographers look at is that we are basically exporting the future population of Appalachia to other regions of the country.
Some of these numbers for Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia are just eye-popping, and they're all in current or former coal-producing communities. Why are these areas seeing such stark projections in particular?
It's the collapse in the coal industry as a whole. We've gone from 100,000 coal miners at the end of World War II down to just a few thousand now across the region as a whole. Unfortunately, all of the promises that the politicians have made that they were going to do something about the situation just hasn't happened. We've just allowed these communities to continue to deteriorate, the population to leave, the tax base to decline, people to out-migrate to find work or commute extremely long distances to work. And when you get down to some of these population levels, you have school consolidations, you have hospitals closing birthing centers, you have hospitals closing entirely, you have fire departments that can't maintain a volunteer fire department. Just the whole basis of what we all would call vibrant communities begins to collapse. You end up with an aging population. The population age of the central Appalachian counties is now approaching 50. Actually, at one point, Buchanan County, Virginia, had a younger population than the average in the state of Virginia. Now it's much older.
If you look at social media, it sometimes feels like the sign of the times is the laughing emoji response. And some people are definitely going to hear this and go, so what? Why does this matter for those communities, but also for the rest of us in greater Appalachia?
It matters a lot for the Appalachian. I think it matters a lot for the nation. Let's just start out from the cultural aspect. You know, if it hadn't been for the Appalachian Mountains, we probably wouldn't have country music and bluegrass music like we do today. But more importantly, maybe you wouldn't have some of the important things for the future. I've spent a lot of time studying what's going on in the drought in the West. We have an unprecedented drought been going on for 20 years from Colorado west to California. We grow over 50% of our vegetables in California, in Arizona, and transport it across the country. And that cannot continue. We're not going to have the water to continue doing that. And where are we going to grow the food? Well, the best place to grow the food is going to be back in Appalachia. We can replant a lot of these broom sage fields. And we're already seeing signs of how it can be done. We've got a number of what I would call vertical agricultural innovative projects in Appalachia. The most famous probably was the AppHarvest, which unfortunately went bankrupt, but the AppHarvest greenhouses are in East Kentucky are still being utilized by other corporations. There's a dramatic new one coming in Carroll County, Virginia, my home county. Osthouse Ventures, which is a United Kingdom company, is starting a $100 million innovative agriculture experiment to grow tomatoes. And the reason is simply because the water is there, the people, the workforce is there, the transportation is there. But we've got a lot of land on which you can grow food in the region. The second reason is I think Appalachia can be an experimental area for how you deal with climate change overall. And unlike Elon Musk, I think Planet B could very well be Appalachia. I think we can get to Appalachia a lot easier than we get to Mars.
There is one group of localities in your article that fit the profile of many of these others, but they're seeing different outcomes. And that's the counties in Tennessee. What's happening there that's different from the rest of this region?
The population is actually reversing and growing in these Tennessee counties that have been historical coal counties. Tennessee ceased to be a coal mining state in 2021 for the first time since the 1890s. And currently there's only one permitted mine in the whole state. It's a very small one in Claiborne County that got accelerated permission this past July. So what's happening there is the Tennessee Valley Authority has been pulling back on coal-fired steam plant generation. That's one factor. And the reason the population is starting to grow is it's easily explained by anybody who drives up Interstate 75 from Knoxville towards Alexa, Kentucky. It's just beautiful, beautiful country. Knoxville has become a bit of a growth center. It's on two major interstate highways. It's had some intelligent planning. And the same applies to Oak Ridge, just north of there. So it's an easy commute from the Oak Ridge areas and Knoxville areas up into the historical coalfield counties of East Tennessee. Plus, there's been some very decent looking ahead by leadership in those counties. And so the net result is some lessons that probably the rest of the region could take a look at.
Jim Branscombe, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
That was Jim Branscombe. We've got a link to his story in the Daily Yonder. It's at our website, wvpublic.org. Nearly 90 years ago, Rainey Bethia was tried and hanged as thousands watched in the banks of the Ohio River in Owensboro, Kentucky. Now his death, the last public hanging in the U.S., is at the center of a new book that takes a closer look at lynching and the American culture that grew out of it. From the Appalachia Mid-South newsroom, Derek Operly has this story.
Everybody went, everybody had a wonderful time, and it was over just like that.
In a 2013 Davis County Public Library interview, the late Bill Shelton painted a shocking picture of the scene from Rainey Bethia's hanging. He remembers the festive atmosphere, the sea of people gathered around the scaffolding as Bethia walked calmly to his death.
They came from everywhere, and there was hawkers. They sold sandwiches, and they sold Coca-Colas, and you'd have thought it was a big picnic or something.
In her new book, American Bloodlines, Owensboro native Sonia Lee examines the 1936 case through court records, contemporary reporting, and her own family history. Lee was inspired to look into the case after learning her grandparents attended the hanging as newlyweds, and in her research, she learned she was related to the prosecuting attorney. She says it's made her think harder about racial violence and that it's not hard to draw a line from Bethia's execution to the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd.
There's just so many things layered up where things could have been different for Rainey Bethia. But at the same time, we can start to see the connections, how racial violence is still evident in our communities.
On a summer morning in 1936, a 70-year-old white woman named Elza Edwards was found dead in her Owensboro home. A local doctor determined she'd been strangled and raped, and 2 days later, authorities shifted the investigation to Bethia, a man in his 20s who Edwards had hired to work in her home. Lee says the evidence against Bethia was flimsy, and that his multiple confessions may have been coerced.
One of the things that we can do through this case is to look and see how it might have been possible that justice would have been done. And that just takes a little bit of curiosity.
4 attorneys were appointed to represent Bethia during the rushed legal proceedings, including the son of the presiding judge. The Commonwealth's attorney chose not to prosecute Bethia for murder, which would have carried a sentence of death by electric chair. Instead, they sought a public execution under an archaic Kentucky law.
They brought an old law out of hiding so that they could then try for rape alone and hang.
After just 4.5 minutes of deliberation by an all-white jury, Bethia was found guilty. During the trial, his defense counsel called no witnesses and delivered no closing argument. A little more than 2 months passed between Edwards' death and Bethia's hanging, and in the run-up, a media circus descended on the town. Most of it focused not on Bethia or the details of the case, but instead on Florence Thompson, who had succeeded her husband as sheriff after his death just months earlier. The skirted sheriff, as she was known, was expected by many to be the executioner, though she didn't end up going through with it herself. Still, the spectacle drew around 20,000 people, enough to nearly fill modern-day Rupp Arena in Lexington. Today, there is no historical marker on the riverfront where Bethia was executed. That's something Rondalyn Randolph, local NAACP president and leader of the Owensboro Community Remembrance Project, has wanted to do for more than a decade.
It shows a respect to Rainey's humanity. It shows that our community is not that community anymore, and we're able to move forward by doing, the right thing.
Lee is hopeful that her book and continued local efforts can ensure that this piece of local history doesn't fade from memory. I'm Derek Operley.
Coming up.
Oh, sing to me of heaven when I am called to.
A singer of sacred music digs into her family history for inspiration. How Ginny Hawker brought primitive Baptist hymns into the mainstream. You're Inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams.
Support for Inside Appalachia is provided by the Charleston, West Virginia Convention and Visitors Bureau, featuring family-friendly activities such as Holly Jolly Brawley and Light the Night at Go-Mart Ballpark this holiday season. Details at charlestonwv.com.
There's a way Appalachian-born singers like Patty Loveless or Ricky Skaggs can bend, glide, and flip over their melodies. It can stir your soul and break your heart at the same time. You can trace this style of singing back to bluegrass legends like Ralph Stanley. But the roots of this sound go even deeper, back to the primitive and old regular Baptist churches where folks like Stanley were raised. For the Rural Remix podcast, reporter Zach Harold introduces us to a woman who helps keep this sacred tradition alive.
This was the sound of Ginny Hawker's childhood. She grew up near Chincoteague, Virginia, where her father worked construction. But every opportunity the family got, they'd take the ferry across the Chesapeake Bay and head to Danville, Virginia, where Ginny's grandfather James still lived.
Even though we weren't living near my grandfather, we spent every minute that we could get free over there with him.
And when they visited Grandpa, they went to Grandpa's church, Old Mill Primitive Baptist. It was far different than the Methodist congregation Ginny attended back home. For one thing, the services were much less formal.
There is no choir, there is no leader, there is no printed order, there's no order for anything of what's going to be done.
In her Methodist church, people sang from a shape note hymnal with the 4-part harmonies all spelled out. The choir was accompanied by a piano and an organ. At her grandpa's church, there were no instruments. There were no harmonies. All the hymns were sung in unison, everybody on the same note.
Sometimes the women would sing in an octave higher. Up there, and if some guy had a really bass, really low voice, he might sing way down there. All unison, but in 3 octaves.
And often the hymns were sung in a call and response style, where the caller would line out a phrase before the rest of the congregation repeated it back.
Such I look to thee.
It wasn't like a performance. This was a prayer.
It's an old tradition found throughout Appalachia in the South, brought to this part of the world from the British Isles. But as can be the case with the things we grow up around, Ginny says she took this musical tradition for granted. That changed in 1986, when Ginny came to Elkins, West Virginia for the Augusta Heritage Festival, and she took a class by legendary West Virginia bluegrass singer-songwriter Hazel Dickens.
I took a songwriting class like I would ever write songs, but I just wanted to be around her,
Ginny knew Hazel had also grown up in the Primitive Baptist tradition, and one day screwed up the courage to make a request. She asked Hazel to sing the hymn, "A Few More Years to Roll."
She said, hardly anybody asked me to sing that one in class, and she said, Did you grow up Primitive Baptist? So the word was out.
At the end of the week, Ginny attended a gospel sing Augusta was hosting at a city park. Hazel was there too, and the organizers invited her on stage to sit with the other instructors.
And Hazel said, I'll come up and sit if Jenny can come up and sit with me. Hazel, I haven't sung in a microphone since I was 18. I can't do that. She put me beside her and she held onto the back of my chair and she said in my ear, "Sing your grandfather's song and put them in his church." And she hung on to the back of my chair, and I could feel her knuckles in my back, holding on to my chair.
Ginny was so nervous she has no memory of what song she sang that day. But nervous as she was, this proved to be a pivot point in Ginny's life. The next year, she was back at Augusta, this time as an instructor. That led to appearances at other folk festivals around the country where Ginny both performed and taught primitive Baptist singing.
Oh, sing to me of heaven when I am called to die.
Everywhere she went, Ginny carried along her most prized possession, a little black book, Lloyd's Primitive Baptist Hymns.
This is the only one that I ever saw used.
See, not long after she started spreading the gospel of primitive Baptist singing, she went to visit her aunt, Annie Maud Puckett, in a nursing home. Annie had also grown up in the Primitive Baptist Church.
And she said, "I hear you're singing those old hymns." And I said, "Yes, when I'm in a place where people are listening."
Though Ginny wasn't always singing the Primitive Baptist songs in religious spaces, she was careful to only bring them out when they'd get the reverence they deserved from the audience.
She said, "Well, go over there on the dresser and take that little black book. That's for you."
Ginny left that day with Annie's copy of Lloyd's Primitive Baptist Hymns. And that battered old hymn book still carries the mark of her aunt's time working in the tobacco fields.
And everybody, all my aunts and uncles, worked in tobacco, handing leaves, pulling tobacco out of the fields and everything. The thumbprints with tobacco on them are pretty obvious.
It was this worn-out, tobacco-stained hymnal that accompanied Ginny to West Virginia University a few years ago. Music professor Travis Steimling invited her to speak and sing at a class. Mary Lynchide was in attendance that day.
We see this short lady walk in, her hair all done up. She just sits there kind of really quietly, and then all of a sudden she starts singing, and it just you can just feel the wall of sound. And it was like, whoa, she's a powerhouse. I want to be like her.
Mary had grown up around music too. Her parents are both classical musicians, and her dad is also a big fan of Southern gospel and bluegrass music. Mary herself grew up playing classical violin before getting into old-time music. But she'd never heard anything like Ginny.
Yeah, there's just something about the sound of that singing that kind of reaches deeper than words, that just kind of grabs you. And I remember after Ginny's visit, I reached out to Travis and I was like, "Do you think Ginny would teach me a couple primitive Baptist hymns? I would really like to study this."
It was perfect timing for Ginny's part.
That was 2021, and we had the vaccine, but we still were not really gathering. Nobody wanted to get anybody my age sick. It was so nice every Thursday to see her face. It just saved my life that winter. I've loved her ever since. She's been my rock.
Their first lesson was a classic old hymn, sung by lots of churches, but none like the Primitive Baptist.
Sing praise. The old Amazing Grace. I sing it through once, that first part, and then I tell them I'm going to chant each line. Saved a wretch like me. And after I chant it, I'll pull you through it. Just relax and go with me. Wretch like me, I once was lost, but now I'm found. Mary was the first and only student I've ever had who could really hear that the first time she heard it.
What Mary heard was something she didn't find in the classical music she'd grown up playing.
There's a lot of faking it in classical music a lot of times, or faking it, move your body in this way to fake emotion while you're playing.
It's even something that was lacking in the modern worship music that she heard in the Baptist church where her family attended and Mary played in the band.
They had a fair amount of traditional hymns they would do, and then it was mixed in with the modern praise and worship music, and I always hated that.
Those other styles might have been more polished, but for Mary, they couldn't beat primitive Baptist singing in conviction.
Ginny always says good singing is better than pretty singing any day. So it was a huge mind-opening experience. You can hear it soothing their own soul, and so it's kind of contagious in that way.
Over the years, the influence of more popular musical styles have creeped into many primitive Baptist congregations, changing the sound Ginny remembers from childhood.
Even if you went back to my grandpa's church, where my cousins still go, there's liable to be somebody in there singing harmony, because they hear it on the radio.
In 2024, Ginny and Mary became part of the Folklife Apprenticeship Program at the West Virginia Humanities Council. As part of that, Ginny wants to take Mary to the places where this music is still being sung the way it was when she was growing up. And because every singer needs a songbook, Ginny has also gifted Mary a brand new copy of Lloyd's Primitive Baptist Hymns.
But hers is all new. I know, I wish I could put some tobacco stains in it. You got to get some tobacco stains on that or something.
I'll start right away.
Yeah.
There may be no tobacco stains, but the soul of primitive Baptist singing was never on paper anyway. The melodies come from whoever taught you the song, and the stories of Ginny's grandfather and her dad, her Aunt Annie, and now of Ginny and Mary, live in the space between those long, lilting notes.
Tell me a little bit further. Dear friends, farewell. I do you tell.
That story was reported by Zach Harold for the Rural Remix, a podcast from the Center for Rural Strategies. For decades, tent revivals were a staple of Christian worship throughout the South. With the onset of TV and later the internet, many congregations opted for cheaper, far-reaching mediums for sharing the gospel. But tent revivals are still going strong too. WUOT's Pierce Gentry takes us to a tent revival in East Tennessee.
On a plot of farmland adjacent to an elementary school in Oneida, hundreds of churchgoers flock to a white tent standing tall on a hill. In the evening moonglow, the only source of light off this countryside road emanates from the tent. The only sounds are the chittering of the cicadas and the music. Lots of music. This is a tent revival being put on by several churches in Scott County. Fed up with the distractions of modern life, they pitched an 800-person tent to host 1 week of nightly revival services.
And right now we need God back, not only in Scott County, but in Tennessee, Knox County, surrounding counties.
That's Jordan Potter, a pastor from Oneida who's been preaching for about a year. He doesn't have his own church and says he felt called by God several months ago to organize a traditional tent revival for his community. After draping banners and posting signs all over town, hundreds showed up to fill the tent, and then some.
I honestly feel like there's going to be a movement here in Scott County that we've never seen before, and it's going to carry on someplace else.
Revivals have been a staple of Appalachian culture for decades. When many people think of Southern evangelism, they think of the white tents, the screaming, the shouting, what Jordan calls a spiritual high.
When you come off of a very good revival, there is a high that you can never get but through God. I don't care what you pick up in this world, you cannot get that same high.
It's a way for followers of Jesus Christ to reconnect with the Spirit, one of the three tenets of the Holy Trinity. While this tradition today feels uniquely American, its origins date back to medieval Europe. Here's Joe Witt, an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Tennessee.
And so that's part of the reason why it becomes such a prominent, method here in this region, is because a lot of people knew about it back over in Europe.
In those days, revivals were a practice of convenience. Large customs like the Eucharist or communion would be taken together by several smaller churches. To accommodate the crowds, tents would be erected. It wasn't until the early to mid 20th century that tent revivals began to take on a religious significance of their own.
And so now, this kind of preaching, this very emotional service is a necessary part. Instead of just kind of a fun event, now it's kind of a necessary dimension of worship.
The spectacle of the services and the intensity of the messages delivered by the pastors involved are designed to evoke emotion from people who otherwise may not accept Christ. For decades, this was the leading method for Southern gospel preachers to spread their message. But with the advent of television in the 1950s, faith leaders quickly adapted to the new medium.
And now you can get these messages to many more people instead of just having to tour to communities.
Potter claims the last tent revival in Scott County was held in the 1950s. For years, he says, he dreamed of putting on one of his own, of reviving his community's faith.
And lo and behold, I didn't think I was going to be the person holding one.
This revival was a hit. Hundreds filled the Oneida Hilltop, many clamoring for an opportunity to connect with other believers of different churches on a personal level.
I think there's something very human in the tent revival and just what it shows us about what religion really is for people and whatever religion we're talking about. In this modern era when, we have technology and ChatGPT and everything seems so mediated, people are still looking for that type of spiritual connection, and tent revivals are one way to provide it.
From Scott County, I'm Pierce Gentry, WUOT News.
Thank God I'm free tonight. Amen.
Beavers have been trapped and hunted in America for thousands of years. They were a food source for indigenous people, and harvesting beaver pelts was an integral part of early European trade. That trade has dwindled, but all too often, landowners who find beavers working on their property still consider them a nuisance. Conservation groups are working to change that. New programs in Kentucky aim to show the environmental benefits of existing with America's largest rodents. WKYU's Derek Parham has more.
Historically, beavers have a bad reputation. They've been labeled nuisance animals, damming rivers and streams, causing floods on roadways and fields, and damaging trees in their pursuit of food and shelter.
Like many other places around the East Coast, around the entire country, beavers were considered a nuisance species, even here at Bernheim.
Evan Patrick is a natural areas manager and founding member of the Beaver Brigade at Bernheim Forest, which covers 16,000 acres of woodland south of Louisville. The brigade is a volunteer group looking to shift the narrative surrounding America's largest rodents.
Allowing beavers to build dams and create beaver wetlands can increase biodiversity by up to 100-fold. That's emergent and wetland plants, that's things like birds, other aquatic mammals like otters and muskrat, invertebrates. It's an incredible increase in biodiversity, and so that's why we want to allow them to continue to create dams within the Arboretum.
Until recently, Bernheim's beaver management looked similar to the rest of the country. Relocate them when they're found on park property. After several decades, the conservation team realized that strategy wasn't working.
That space, that void will be filled by another individual. The other issue is that beavers operate in family units, and so it's frequent that when an individual is captured and relocated, that they don't survive, or there's a high mortality rate because they rely on their other family members to survive and to thrive.
Over the last 5 years, the park has built up their infrastructure to work with their beavers rather than against them, educating landowners, conservation groups, and the public on the benefits of coexisting with wildlife rather than clearing native species from their property.
But we also moved into the realm of coexistence, where we are installing infrastructure that allows beavers to still exist and create high-quality habitat, but we get to control how high the water level is, and they're not damaging constructed infrastructure. So we're protecting trails, we're protecting our roads, we're protecting our culverts, but we're also getting all the ecological services and the benefits from the beavers.
With the support of national groups like the Southeast Beaver Alliance and the Beaver Institute, the Beaver Brigade has installed wooden stakes made of beavers' preferred food and enhanced dam and lodge sites that draw the park's beavers where their activity would be beneficial. Conservation Director Andrew Berry says Bernheim's Harrison Fork stream restoration has used those same methods to bolster the park's biodiversity.
It's an incredible process. That project took 12 years to get started, and now it's going to take probably 2 years for the construction, the revegetation. It'll take another year for it to heal and all that stuff to get really established and growing. And so we're looking at 15 years to get to the point where we think beavers are going to come in and do something incredible, almost like a second phase.
That effort isn't just happening at one forest, it's a nationwide movement. While it's a slow process, Kentucky Fish and Wildlife fur bearers biologist Laura Palmer says they've also worked with landowners to steer away from relocation.
I try to not refer to wildlife as nuisance animals, but there are definitely occasions when they do cause problems. They can flood roads, damage crops and timber and things like that. But by and large, we try to encourage people to kind of live with wildlife.
Across the country, Patrick says Bernheim's efforts are proving in real time the benefits of native species and fueling policy changes for their protection.
That is part of the process that Southeast Beaver Alliance is working on now, too, is publishing statements and comments for state wildlife action plans to include language about the ecological benefits of beavers. That's that piece of policy changing that Bernheim, Southeast Beaver Alliance, and the Beaver Institute are all working toward.
The efforts of the Beaver Brigade, the Southeast Beaver Alliance, and the Beaver Institute have made their way across the region to state wildlife action plans in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Mississippi, and to the annual BeaverCon Educational Conference in Minnesota. I'm Derek Parham in Bowling Green.
Air pollution in the Mon Valley of Pennsylvania has been the focus of environmental concerns and lawsuits for years. But some groups are also looking at water quality. As part of its series, Reporting from the Mon, the Allegheny Front's Julie Grant heads out with the river watchdog to see what's happening with the waste from a chemical plant.
It's a bright fall day, and the Three Rivers Waterkeeper, a nonprofit group, is taking their boat out on a beautiful stretch of the Monongahela River near the Elizabeth Bridge, more than 20 miles downstream of the Point in Pittsburgh. People fish off one of the banks. There are geese and a blue heron nearby. The river, once an industrial powerhouse, still has plenty of industries along the shores. Captain Evan Clark secures the boat at one spot where Synthomer, a chemical resins manufacturing plant, releases stormwater and other wastewater into the river. These are outfalls regulated by the State Department of Environmental Protection. He hops out and starts digging in the nearly black muck.
Yeah, there's a real strong petrochemical type of smell in the sediment.
Yeah, I can smell it. The digging creates a small pool of water. It's got a colorful sheen to it. Koa Wrights, an environmental scientist with the Waterkeeper, crouches down and scoops the mud into a jar. She says they'll send this sample to a lab.
Whenever we are moving the sediment around and seeing that sheen, that is another thing that leads us to believe that this is not a natural process, but is because of industrial activities.
The Waterkeepers question whether it contains chemicals, oil, and grease. They're interested in the Synthomer plant, formerly Eastman Chemical, because it's exceeded its water pollution limits more than any other industry along the Mon by far. The Waterkeepers analyzed compliance reports that industry sent to the DEP between 2019 and 2024. Most of Synthomer's exceedances were for aluminum and zinc. In 2023, Eastman had agreed to pay a $2.4 million fine to the EPA and the DEP for alleged pollution of the Mon River, including discharges of oil, zinc, and xylene. Eastman, and then later Synthomer, agreed to fix these problems in a consent decree, though exceedances for aluminum have continued through 2025, as well as a few other substances.
They've been known to exceed for xylenes, which is in a suite of chemicals called BTEX chemicals, which are volatile organic compounds. And so part of the reason that we are concerned about this is because we know that they use these things. We know that there have been exceedances of their permit of these things.
In an email, Synthomer said it's complying with the consent decree. Another reason the Waterkeepers are taking samples from Synthomer's outfalls today is because they can. Until now, the water was too high. Then last summer, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers removed the Elizabeth Dam. Clark says now river levels here are lower.
On the upper side, water dropped a ton, and all of a sudden, not only are we able to access outfalls safely, but we're also able to see a lot of the sediment that was under 4 feet of water, and we've seen some stuff that has caused us to ask a lot more questions.
questions like what happens to Synthomer's industrial wastewater, which comes from its production processes. They know that waste gets sent to the local sewage treatment plant.
We've been learning a lot more about Synthomer's connection to West Elizabeth Sanitary Authority.
Hannah Homan, environmental steward for the Waterkeepers, has been looking into it.
We're trying to learn if there are pollutants that are going from Synthomer or any industrial facility to a wastewater treatment plant that isn't being properly treated for or it's not being tested for.
Captain Clark steers the boat under the Elizabeth Bridge to the outfall of the sewage treatment plant, where it discharges into the river, and they take samples of the water. The sewage plant is currently seeking a renewal of its own water pollution permit from the DEP. The draft of that permit creates for the first time a limit for zinc in its discharge, meant to protect the Mon River. It gives the plant 2 years to meet the new zinc limit. In a letter to the DEP, the sewage plant said it had not been testing the wastewater it receives from Synthomer for zinc, but that it planned to do so. The DEP did not provide comment for the story. Results from the Waterkeeper sampling by the West Elizabeth sewage plant found levels of zinc and numerous other industrial chemicals, and at Synthomer, soil samples had detectable levels of oil and grease, aluminum, and some metals.
It's a big learning curve of trying to understand how waste is moving and then how it's interacting with our waterways.
Holman says they'll continue keeping an eye on Synthomer and other industries to track water pollution in Pittsburgh's rivers. I'm Julie Grant.
Chef William Disson's memories are seasoned with the flavors of West Virginia's mountains. Disson has taken some of those memories and turned them into award-winning cuisine at the marketplace. That's his James Beard-nominated restaurant in Asheville. Last fall, Folkways reporter Margaret McLeod-Leaf spoke with Disson. He was in Charleston to talk about his debut cookbook, Thoughtful Cooking.
You write about learning to garden and cook alongside your grandmother in West Virginia. What was a typical day with her, from picking vegetables to getting dinner on the table?
You know, one of my most vivid memories is growing up and being at my grandmother Jane's farm in Sandyville, West Virginia. And they lived up in the holler, and they had a nice house and garden and right along the creek side, and they had bees to pollinate the garden, and they had a canning shed adjacent to the garden and a small barn. And really one of my most vivid memories was, peak summer, probably mid-August. You could feel the humidity like hanging in the holler. And my grandmother said, "All right, Billy, go get some corn." And I remember running out into the field and waddling back as, young kid, armful of corn, and we sat in the front porch and shucked it, and she had a pot of salt water going in the stove, and we boiled it. I remember slathering it probably with country crock and put some salt on it, and my head exploded off my shoulders, and it was like I've never tasted corn before until this day. And for me, it was really inspiring because I felt like I learned something about food and connection to nature and why things taste a certain way when they're grown locally, when they're fresh, and when they're ripe. And that didn't really hit me until later on in life, but it's a moment I think back about quite a bit.
So those experiences clearly shaped how you cook today.
100%. Fast forward, I was very fortunate. I went to culinary school at the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and when I was there were 13 master chefs there teaching, and, put in perspective, there's only about 65 in the world. So I was very blessed to have some of the best chefs teaching me. I remember this one French chef, and I won't imitate his accent, but he said, if you want to be the best chef, you have to use the best ingredients. And at the time, he was using things like foie gras and truffles and caviar. And as I, formulated my palate as a chef and kind of the recipe repertoire that I wanted to use, I had an aha moment, really regressing back and remembering that experience at my grandmother's farm and thinking, if I want to be the best chef, I need to use fresh ingredients because fresh is best.
So you've written your first cookbook, and I'm wondering why it's important to you to have written this cookbook, and also why now?
For years I was trying to figure out what my story was to tell. Being from Appalachia, we're all storytellers here, right? There's a lot of written, but also a lot of verbal history. And but for me, the story to tell was about the connection to our community, to the heritage we have here in Appalachia, but also to the connection we have to the earth. I'm not a Greenpeace hippie by any means, but I do feel like what I learned from my grandparents was about the importance of taking care of nature and taking care of your community. For them, they didn't, poison their fields with chemicals because they wanted to be able to till and grow. And, there were weeds in the fields, and they said those weeds are good, right? We till them back into the field, they add nutrition into the soil. Honeybees to pollinate the garden, right? And these were things that I didn't really understand as a child, but if you look at kind of that connection to nature, you realize it's all very cyclical and connected. I think after my travels and educating myself and finding my way back to Asheville and back to Appalachia, I started to have these aha moments. I love city life. I love the energy in the city and the noises and the people. But when you get into the mountains and you can go get lost in the woods and take a hike and, listen to a stream or a waterfall, there's this connection you have that you don't get anywhere else. And the beauty of Appalachia really was kind of calling me home. And finding myself back there, I really felt like I had this story to tell people about that. From being able to travel around the world and travel around the country, people, I think, they have these ideas of who we are as Appalachians, hillbillies or rednecks, and, we're all related to one another, right? But I think when they get here and they come to visit and they meet people like us, they realize that we are, we're some of the best people around, and our culture and our history and our heritage is really deep.
I noticed that the word thoughtful is in the title of the book, and I wonder if you can tell me more about that, what you mean by thoughtful cooking.
It's kind of like peeling the layers of an onion back. There's this idea of cooking with intention, right? Planning a meal out. In the kitchen, we have a French term called mise en place, and it literally means everything in its place. But it's also the prep you make, the things you cut and you prepare as you want to cook in the kitchen. It's also thoughtful in terms of, thinking about who you're getting your food from, right? How are they growing the food? Are you growing the food? What are you doing to take care of the earth? And are you doing things that, help the community around you? And then the even bigger picture, is I believe in sustainability very deeply, but I'm not out hitting people over the head with it. I believe it's a way we should implement those ideals into our day-to-day lives. Because if we want our next generation, the generation after that, to have nice things like we have to take care of them. And this idea that we can all do little things by eating thoughtfully and cooking thoughtfully, go to the farmer's market, talk to the growers that are growing delicious and nutritious food, and try it. Even if you're scared of an ingredient, you know what? Be brave. Go out and try something new.
So what would you say are the tastes of Appalachia? How would you describe what does Appalachian cuisine taste like?
I was really fortunate. A few years back, I got asked to do a TV show with this very famous chef named Gordon Ramsay. And he asked me to be an ambassador for his TV show to show him through, Central Appalachia and the Smoky Mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains. And I took him out and we went foraging and we went fly fishing and we cooked a lot of indigenous ingredients, a lot of Cherokee dishes. And after the show, we sat down and we were talking. He said, I've traveled the world 10 times over. He said, Appalachia reminds me of places like Tuscany, Italy, that are world-renowned for their cuisine. The heirloom ingredients, the heritage cooking techniques, the sense of place. He said, I've never been to a place like this. I can't believe the world isn't just putting you all up on a pedestal.
At your restaurant in Asheville, the Marketplace, obviously you serve Appalachian-influenced cuisine. I'm sure people come to that restaurant because they are seeking a taste of home. And then you have people who've maybe never tasted some of these dishes or flavors. And I'm wondering what reactions you get from people inside Appalachia, but people that are passing through that are outside Appalachia. What kind of reactions do you get?
I always joke the Appalachian gateway drug or gateway ingredient are ramps. People say, what's a ramp? I said, well, it's a wild, like a wild onion, wild garlic that grows in the forest. It's not cultivated. And it only grows for a month of the year. So we try to get it and pickle it and preserve it and keep it so we can have that flavor throughout the year. When people taste it and they say, this is a really delicious flavor, especially if you're a garlic fan, ramps are like garlic on steroids. So I think there's flavors like that. There's flavors of, wild food, of, forage food, wild mushrooms. There's flavors of, campfire cooking, and just rich, hearty dishes that stick to your soul, right? And I think those are things that people talk a lot about Southern food being, kind of quintessential American cuisine, but Appalachia is the backbone of the South, and I feel like our cuisine really is wrought in our history and heritage. Not just of modern America, but also historically of Native American cuisine and that hunter-gatherer background, and also food of necessity.
I'm just thinking about Thanksgiving coming up. Obviously in Asheville, that's going to look different for a lot of people. But I'm also wondering, what are some of the Thanksgiving things that you have around your own table?
One of my favorite ingredients, I worked with Slow Food USA for this, for an ingredient. They have a thing called the Arc of Taste, where they are preserving different heirloom ingredients. And one of them that's really near and dear to me is the candy roaster squash. And it's a type of, hardy squash, pumpkin, that was it was cultivated originally by the Cherokee of Central Appalachia. And it's this kind of long banana-looking shape squash, and the flavor is really delicious to me. So we love to make a candy roaster squash soup out of it. Roast it off slowly, nice and caramelized, and cook it slow and low into really delicious pureed soup. Other flavors I like. I love stuffing. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I love a good crispy but also chewy stuffing. And I love mushrooms. And this time of year, there's a wild mushroom that grows called a maitake, or a hen of the wood mushroom. And we love to roast that off and fold that into our stuffing. To me, it just adds a really kind of depth of flavor. I love soup beans, cornbread. That's quintessential Appalachian cuisine. But over Thanksgiving, just setting a meal together, and regardless of your background or culture, I think that idea of kind of setting the Appalachian table and sitting with your family and sitting with your friends and sharing a meal is something that is really quintessential to who we are as a culture and a community.
Very well said. I agree. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
William Disson's cookbook is Thoughtful Cooking, Recipes Rooted in the New South, published by Countryman Press. That story is part of our Folkways reporting project, which covers arts and culture in our region. You can find more Folkways stories at our website, wvpublic.org. Till next time, thanks for joining us as we journey throughout Appalachia. Our theme music is by Matt Jackford. Other music this week was provided by Ginny Hawker, Hazel Dickens, Mary Lynn Scheid, Jeff Ellis, Blue Dot Sessions, Frank George, John Blissard, and Hello June. Bill Lynch is our producer. Abby Neff is our associate producer. Our executive producer is Eric Douglas. Kelly Libby is our editor. Our audio mixer is Patrick Stevens. We had help this week from Folkways editor Chris Julin. And congratulations to longtime Inside Appalachia contributors Molly Bourne and Xander Alloy on their marriage. You can find us on Instagram at InAppalachia. You can also send us an email to insideappalachia@wvpublic.org. Visit wvpublic.org/InsideAppalachia to subscribe to our newsletter and stream all of our stories. Or look for Inside Appalachia on your favorite podcast app. Inside Appalachia is a production of West Virginia Public Broadcasting.